GM shocked investors when it warned that Trump's new auto tariffs could wipe out up to $5 billion from this year's earnings. Within weeks, factories from Detroit to Ontario fell quiet. Shifts were cut, suppliers froze operations, and more than 50,000 jobs suddenly looked uncertain. Even Wall Street pulled back, slashing GM's outlook as fears spread across the entire industry. What looked like a policy tweak has now turned into a growing shutdown across North America's auto belt. And the pressure keeps building, from rising parts costs to stalled production lines, setting off a chain reaction that no one can ignore. When the White House announced a 25% tariff on all imported vehicles and components in April 2025, GM's finance team realized the impact would be immediate. Within days, the company warned shareholders that the new duties would erase $4 to $5 billion from its 2025 earnings. The math was brutal. Most GM models still rely on 40% imported parts, meaning almost every Silverado, Equinox, and Escalade rolled straight into the tariff zone. And that wasn't the only hit. Existing steel and aluminum duties pushed costs even higher, adding another $3,200 to the price of each truck before it even reached the dealership. Suppliers felt the strain first. A steering knuckle that once cost $28 jumped to $36, and similar increases rippled through more than 30,000 parts that make up a modern vehicle. GM tried to absorb some of the early shock, hoping demand would hold steady. But Wall Street had a different view. Analysts began lowering expectations, warning that margins would tighten fast. By mid-year, pressure from investors forced GM to raise prices, even as consumers were already pulling back. These rising costs didn't stay on spreadsheets for long. They set off tremors across GM's entire production network, creating delays, pushing plants into temporary pauses, and weighing on already fragile supply chains. As factories braced for the next wave of disruptions, it became clear that this tariff shock wasn't just a financial problem. It was the spark that disrupted the rhythm of GM's assembly lines and the communities that depend on them. The first real signs of trouble appeared on April 11th, when Detroit's Factory Zero went quiet. Management called it a temporary pause, but for the 200 workers sent home, it felt like the start of something larger. As the tariff costs rippled through GM's operations, more plants began to slow. By late April, the Ingersoll CAMI facility halted BrightDrop van production entirely, announcing that assembly would not restart until October. That decision alone pushed 1,200 workers into layoffs on May 2nd. The pressure didn't stop there. In Oshawa, the truck line cut its overnight shift, wiping out 700 jobs with a single scheduling change. Advertised openings disappeared across job boards, and trailers that once moved nonstop now sat idle in factory lots. Suppliers, already stretched thin by rising costs, started to fold. Adient shut down 2 Tennessee plants and eliminated 400 union jobs, leaving entire neighborhoods suddenly uncertain about their future. The slowdown spread far beyond plant gates. In Michigan, small diners saw a 40% drop in customers almost overnight. An Indiana auto shop warned that losing even a portion of local manufacturing work could force them to cut half their staff. Wall Street took note of the widening fallout and slashed 18% off GM's market outlook. These pauses were described as flexible idling, but each quiet shift chipped away at confidence. As more plants braced for disruptions, the strain moved deeper into GM's electric ambitions, where stalled production carried even heavier consequences. As GM dealt with rising costs across its traditional lineup, another problem was building inside the company's electric division. For the last 2 years, GM positioned itself as the leader of America's EV push. Factories were retooled, battery plants were expanded, and the Ultium platform was supposed to carry GM through the decade. But 3 policy changes landed almost at the same time, and together they hit the EV program harder than anyone expected. The first blow came when the $7,500 federal EV tax credit was repealed. Overnight, the price of electric trucks and SUVs jumped beyond what many families were willing to pay. Then Congress froze funding for the national charging network, leaving drivers with rising range anxiety and no clear sign of when new stations would be built. Soon after, tariffs were placed on battery minerals. That meant the Ultium batteries, GM's most expensive component, became even costlier to produce. By early summer, Factory Zero, once promoted as a symbol of America's electric future, was filled with unsold Silverado EVs sitting under plastic covers. Internal data showed interest in GM's EVs sliding from 14% to just 7% once incentives disappeared. Even 0% financing couldn't overcome climbing insurance prices and higher electricity rates, which made ownership feel less affordable than before. GM CFO Paul Jacobson admitted that the company needs to sell 100,000 Ultium trucks each year just to break even. But 2025 projections point to only 65,000 sales, leaving a wide gap between expectations and reality. Each unsold EV ties up around $45,000 in inventory, while batteries slowly degrade in summer storage heat, further cutting into margins. With consumer demand cooling and production costs rising, GM was forced to rethink its electric strategy. And as these pressures built, workers and unions across North America began to fracture over who should carry the burden of this shift. As GM's slowdown spread, the tension inside its factories grew sharper. The workforce, once united by badge pride, began to split over what the tariffs really meant for their livelihoods. UAW leadership praised the policy, calling the tariffs a long overdue step to protect American jobs. But across the border, Unifor accused GM of sacrificing Canadian workers to score political points in Tennessee, where incentives and lower costs now made expansion easier. On the plant floors, the debate felt more personal. Some workers who once supported tariffs now questioned whether the promises matched the reality of shrinking paychecks. Many were placed on flexible, elastic idling, earning about 75% of their wages but losing the overtime that kept families ahead of bills. Old memories of Lordstown's 2019 closure resurfaced, and toolboxes stayed packed by the door in case another closure notice arrived. Trump's public response only added frustration. When asked about GM's struggle, he brushed it off with a short remark. GM made their choices. To workers already on the edge, it sounded less like support and more like a warning. As factories wrestled with these divisions, the shock from GM's slowdown began spilling into the global auto industry, pulling other companies into the same storm. GM's troubles didn't stay inside its own factories. The tariff shock moved quickly across the entire global auto system, creating new problems for companies that had nothing to do with GM's internal decisions. In Canada, the Stellantis Windsor plant, the last minivan plant in the country, fell into a 12-week scheduling crisis. That alone triggered around 900 layoffs across Indiana and Michigan as parts flow and assembly timing broke down. Dealer lots in the Midwest soon filled with unsold Pacificas, even as their prices climbed because so many of their components were hit by tariff inflation. Volvo Group North America faced its own wave of disruption. The cost of a heavy-duty rig rose from $165,000 to $180,000, pushing fleet buyers to delay or cancel orders. That shift forced Volvo to prepare temporary layoffs for nearly 1,000 workers in Pennsylvania and Virginia. The impact overseas was just as severe. GM Korea, which sends 88% of its production to the U.S., suddenly faced an existential threat. A 25% tariff on its exports made its pricing impossible to sustain, raising fears of a collapse similar to GM's withdrawal from Australia in 2017. Hyundai and Kia rushed to shift more production into Alabama and Georgia, but their new capacity won't be ready until 2027, leaving a multi-year gap filled with uncertainty. And smaller suppliers were hit hardest. One Ontario parts maker lost $1.2 million in a single week after a customs error turned routine cross-border shipping into a tariff minefield. As these ripple effects grew, GM's leadership had to confront a harder question. What would it take to restart production at home while the global system around them continued to strain? Inside GM's planning rooms, the question everyone keeps returning to is simple. When can the lines restart, and under what conditions? Executives have mapped out 3 possible futures, each shaped by supply chains, policy shifts, and market confidence. In the best-case scenario, relief arrives by late June. Brazilian wiring looms and Mexican engines move freely again, clearing the bottlenecks that stalled production. Silverado output in Fort Wayne and Oshawa begins to recover, and Detroit's EV lines hold steady. Ultium production meets the reduced forecast of 65,000 trucks, keeping margins thin but still in positive territory. It's not a full rebound, but it prevents deeper damage. The middle path looks far more fragile. If new U.S. tariffs on Japanese and Korean electronics go into effect in July, prices for infotainment modules and other key components spike again. Plant utilization dips, and uncertainty in Washington delays any relief measures. Credit rating agencies begin hinting at possible downgrades, which puts even more pressure on GM's finances. The worst case is the scenario everyone hopes to avoid. If China restricts rare earth exports, Ultium battery production halts altogether. EV plants in the US and Canada could go dark for an indefinite period, leaving thousands of workers idle and pushing GM's debt outlook into dangerous territory. Morale would fall quickly, and recovery would become far more complicated. These three paths show how much hinges on policy and supply chains. And they lead to a larger question. Are these disruptions part of a strategy or a self-inflicted stall? Tariffs were introduced as a fast way to bring jobs home, yet they've produced shutdowns, rising costs, and widespread uncertainty. GM's lines can restart if conditions ease, but the threat of prolonged stagnation remains. The central debate now is whether these tariffs are rebuilding American manufacturing or quietly weakening the foundation beneath it. Tell me what you think. Are the tariffs helping or hurting? And can GM's EV plan survive this pressure? Don't forget to subscribe and check out the next video on your screen.